Welcome, I'm Audrey Rinlisbacher. This is the Principles of Liberty class. I was talking to a young man the other day. He's like a junior in high school, and he just finished taking the AP American History test, and I asked him all about it. And he said, well, the book was this thick, and I had to read a chapter every couple days, and it was super boring. And on the test, they kept emphasizing that he would do best if he had a lot of stuff memorized, a lot of people, a lot of dates, a lot of events. So that's what he spent the whole school year studying American history, AP American history, okay? This is our American history program in high school. This is what we're giving our students. He had to memorize all this information. Paul Johnson wrote A History of the American People, and this is what he said about American history. The creation of the United States is the greatest of all human achievements. No other national story holds such tremendous lessons for the American people themselves and for the rest of mankind. We need to retell it, for if we can learn these lessons and build upon them, the whole of humanity will benefit in the new age that is now opening. So this young man I was talking to probably didn't hear that quote, just guessing. And what he didn't get in AP American history, in a really great school, in a great area of the United States of America, was why. He didn't get what Paul Johnson is talking about in any way, shape, or form. His American history experience was not about why the creation of the United States of America is one of the greatest of all human achievements. And because we aren't teaching our youth to know why America is so powerful and why it's so great and why it's such an incredible human achievement, the next generation won't have the tools to keep liberty alive. They'll know who lived and when they lived and what events took place, but they won't know why any of it happened. And when you don't know why something happened, you don't know how to make it happen again. Richard Maybury said, history is a logical sequence of events. You don't need to be a professional historian to understand it, and once you do understand it, you'll be better able to cope with the events of today. That is so true. So, we're going to start by looking at something that's called the Tytler cycle. Alexander Tytler, Lord Woodhouse-Lee was his name. He was from Scotland. He was a British lawyer and writer. He lived from 1747 to 1813. So this cycle, and I just want to, as a side note, say this. We live in a time that talks about time as being linear. But time is also cyclical. History does repeat itself. There's the same famous saying we say all the time, that if you don't know history, you'll repeat it. And that's exactly what we're doing. And we want to understand Alexander Tytler's cycle of history of civilizations so that we can better understand how to stop repeating it. He said that the world's greatest civilizations have lasted about 200 years. And he means in a certain form, and we're going to talk about that, what that means in the next class. But for our purposes, let's just look at the sequence, and we'll refer back to it again and again as we learn what it really means. So, any given civilization starts out in bondage. And that bondage, over time, develops, if this civilization grows and becomes strong again and has liberty again, it's always begun by great amounts of spiritual faith. And we'll talk about what that means too. That spiritual faith creates great courage, and the courage leads to liberty. And when people have great amounts of liberty, they always have abundance. That abundance leads to complacency. The complacency leads to apathy, which creates dependence and leads those people back into bondage. Okay? And as I've talked about this Tytler cycle lots of places, and when I learned it myself, I think you can probably see modern America in there somewhere. But we'll talk about some other civilizations. I want to go back and focus for this class on the first three elements of any civilization, how they get to a place of liberty. Spiritual faith, courage, and liberty, what those mean, and how you attain them. Will Durant said, the only real revolution is in the enlightenment of the improvement of character. Revolutions begin with individuals, and they begin in individuals' hearts. And when a civilization becomes free, it becomes free because individuals themselves become free. And the way they become free is by acknowledging absolutes and obeying them. I have a good friend, and she really got hit hard. There was the big real estate bubble in the West, and she got hit very hard by that. And for about a year, we're good friends with her and her husband. We would go to dinner on a regular basis, and every time we went to dinner, she would just despair. Oh, she and she would spend so much time every week on her computer looking all the new legislation, and for the first time in her life, really paying attention to what was going on in the country and what the government was doing. And she was so angry, and she was so despondent about what was going on. And I kept talking to her about, there is hope. There are answers. It doesn't have to be this way. There's a reason why we got where we are today, and that's what this series of lectures is all about. It's about how we got to where we are today, and when the country understands how we got to where we are today, they can begin fixing it. But as long as they think that it's because there's just happened to be some really wicked people in place right now, and as soon as we kick them out of office, everything will be okay, they're never going to fix it. Because it's in the very fabric of the country, and most of all, it's in the people's hearts. And so this good friend finally became convinced, picked up 5,000 Year Leap and some other readings that are attached to this course, and it was a revolution in her heart. She suddenly had hope again, and she thought, there are principles, there are reasons, there's a foundation for liberty, and we're not obeying it, and so that's why we don't have freedom, and we can fix it. And she's a great public speaker, and she began to go out and speak at different organizations and rallies about how her hope had been restored in people and in the country because she knew what some of the answers were. So I want to encourage everyone, especially those who are despairing about what's happening, to understand that there are answers, and as long as we can stay hopeful, we have to stay in a positive place. We have to be full of faith that there's a God and He'll help us fix things if we'll pay attention to what the truth is and obey it. If you've heard of a book called The Road to Serfdom, that's been something that's been going around a lot. People have been reading that. That's by a man named Hayek. I think it's F.A. Hayek. And he wrote it in the 1940s to the West, mostly to British and Americans, to warn us that we were on the road to serfdom. And he says some wonderful things in there. We'll talk about him a lot during these classes, but here's something that he said. What this book contains is a warning that unless we mend the principles of our policy, some very unpleasant consequences will follow, which most of those who advocate these policies do not want. He felt very strongly that there were people in place who were passing legislation and who were leaders that thought that they were headed somewhere, and he wanted to show them they were headed in exactly the opposite direction, because what they were doing was putting socialist policies in place, trying to create liberty. It was impossible. And the whole focus of the book was to help them understand that there are principles and you've got to mend those first. When Tocqueville, if you've heard of Democracy in America, Tocqueville came to America in the mid-1800s. He wrote a great book called Democracy in America. And in the preface of that book, he was writing it to the French. Now, it was the good and bad parts of democracy, and we'll talk about that later on too. But in the preface to the French people, this is what he said to them. Let us borrow from her principles rather than the details of her laws. He understood that there needed to be a French way of being free and an American way of being free, but the principles would be true for everybody all the time. Ezra Benson, the former Secretary of Agriculture under Eisenhower, said this. Men in the public spotlight constantly are asked to express an opinion on a myriad of government proposals and projects. All too often, answers to these questions seem to be based not upon any solid principle. Decisions should be based upon and measured against certain basic principles regarding the proper role of government. If principles are correct, then they can be applied to any specific proposal with confidence. And Emerson wrote, our life is an apprenticeship to the truth. So, the first principle of government and economics is that there are principles of government and economics. And we have to agree here, or nothing else I say will make any sense at all. but there are. The founders believed it, they taught it, they absorbed those, and in the next class we'll talk about the type of education that they had that specifically trained them in the principles of liberty so that they could create it. Thomas Reid, the founding generation studied a lot of the Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, and Thomas Reid was a predominant one. And he said that there were first principles, that they were self-illuminating, self-evident, if you have ever heard that phrase, common sense, that there are some things, he said, they're written by the very finger of God on the hearts of men. That there's something called a conscience and there's something called guilt, and it's real and it's there for a reason and it's from God, and that when you hear truth, it is self-illuminating. You feel a light go on. You know that that is true. And it was those first principles that should be the foundation of all education, as they should be the foundation of a life and of government. Let me give you a couple examples. C.S. Lewis gives a great example. He talks about people being on a subway or a bus or something like that. And you go in and you take a seat and you get up to grab something and you come back and someone's taken your seat. And like, that's not fair. You know, you're kind of miffed at that. Why? Who told you there was anything wrong with that? Did your mom sit you down when you were little with a little tutorial? Now, there's this thing called fairness, and you know, you need to know that it's important. No. Small children feel a sense of fairness. They know. C.S. Lewis makes a beautiful argument about there would be no reason for us to even have discussions about justice or mercy or love or fairness if they didn't exist at all. If they didn't exist first. They have to come from somewhere, and they come from inside us. We're born with them. So here's another example. I could go really just about anywhere on this planet. And I could go out in the woods and pick up a stick and whittle it and make a whistle. And from that moment on, whose is it? It's mine, right? You know it's mine. I know it's mine. If I'm in a foreign country with somebody whose language I don't even speak, are they going to think it's mine or are they going to think it's theirs? They're going to think it's mine. And Locke explains this. He says when we add labor to anything, then that's how we create ownership. But the point is that there's something there about this idea of ownership. Not only about the idea of ownership, but about the fact that I have some kind of right to keep you from taking it. That there's some justification that if we both went before a fair judge, he would say, yes, it was mine, and no, you don't have any right to take it. This is what C.S. Lewis calls the Tao, the foundational principles of all civilizations over all time, that are true for everybody all of the time. And great works in history, I mean, 7 Habits included. The whole introduction is all about, I want to convince you first that there are principles, because there are. And the founders knew this, and they founded their society on it. Here's another example. We live in a very sexually liberal society. We're very promiscuous. And yet, if you're in a relationship and there's some kind of commitment, especially in a marital relationship, somehow it's wrong. Like, who said it was wrong if I go be with someone else? Why is that wrong? Who said that was wrong? That's not even in the marriage contract. And yet, we'll tear people apart in the media because somebody was, unfaithful. And all the time, we want to say that everything is relative. So there's this dichotomy in our society, right? This is something about the founders that's important for us to understand. The relative uniformity of fundamental thought shared by these men included strong and unusually well-defined convictions concerning religious principles, political precepts, economic fundamentals, and long-range social goals. On particulars, of course, they quarreled. But when discussing fundamental precepts and ultimate objectives, they seemed practically unanimous. And if you know anything about their personalities, you know how incredibly different they were as individuals. And yet, because of their commitment to the Bible, which we'll talk about next time, and absolutes, when it came down to what the founding principles were, they could agree. Dr. Witherspoon, who was a mentor to Madison, the father of the Constitution, and many others, said this: "A republic once equally poised must either preserve its virtue or lose its liberty and by some tumultuous revolution either return to its first principles or assume a more unhappy form. So he understood, if you actually put a republic in place, and how did he know this? Because he knew history. Because he learned from history. And he saw the cycle in Greece, and he saw the cycle in Rome, and he saw the cycle in the Middle East. And over and over and over again, when you had a republic in place, if the people didn't stay virtuous and understand the first principles, it ended. So there's hope in knowing what the truth is, and there's answers in obeying it. And if we can start with ourselves, then we can begin to teach others. There was a grassroots movement in May 1774 in Virginia, and the House of Burgesses wanted the people to get together. They had a meeting, and they wrote up a resolution to the British government trying to convince them to give them some slack, to lighten up, because there was starting to be talk of revolution, and the people appealed and appealed and appealed, right? And this was one of the resolutions to the crown. So I want to just give you a taste. I want you to know that the founders really thought and talked this way. It's very important. So these are the words of this resolution. Just listen to the words that they wrote into this resolution. Resolve that our ancestors were by the laws of nature and nations entitled to its privileges, immunities, and advantages. The fundamental principle of the peoples being governed by no laws to which they had not given their consent by the representatives freely chosen by themselves is contrary to the first principles of the Constitution, is totally incompatible with the privileges of a free people and the natural rights of mankind. That was the kind of language that they used. That was the way they talked to each other. That was their understanding of government and economics. And so that's why we're going to talk next class about their education. The founders recognized that if the citizens of the Republic lacked a clear understanding of their constitutional history and form of government, religious and political liberty would be lost. The unscrupulously ambitious, I'm not going to name any names, would easily triumph over ignorance. Of what? Of constitutional history and their form of government. Tyranny could only be prevented by a virtuous people who were also well versed in the nation's first principles. We're going to talk more about virtue later on in this set of classes, but I want to emphasize one thing here. The first and very most important definition of virtue is very simple, and it's what we've been talking about for the last 20 minutes. It is a recognition of absolutes and an obedience to them. And I want to continue to emphasize to you that that's what the founders were all about. When they say we must be virtuous, they didn't mean that we should be participating in extravagant religious ceremonies all the time. They didn't even always necessarily mean, they did mean we should be personally moral, but they meant more than that. They meant that we should understand and live by first principles because they create liberty. That's why they studied the way they studied and talked the way they talked, because they knew that was the foundation. So, Jonathan Edwards, 1703 to 58. I don't know if you've ever heard him, but he was the first major thinker in America. In the Middle Ages, especially Christianity, was all about obeying out of fear. I mean, that was a big part of it, right? That there was hellfire and damnation, and you better do what's right or you were going to get it. But Edwards had this new message about obedience out of joy, about God's abundance and his desire to bless us. And because he loves us, he wants us to be joyful. He wants us to pursue happiness. He wants us to be happy. This was something that we had been moving in this direction, but he really put words to it. He was very much an intellectual. He wrote The Freedom of the Will and some other beautiful tracts. His religious doctrine matched the ideas of liberty and happiness. And then George Whitefield was his mouthpiece. He was the one that took Edwards' doctrine and took it to the people. He had firesides everywhere. He traveled up and down the coast all throughout the country, teaching this new message of if we want to be free, we've got to be obedient to God and truth, and we've got to be worthy of liberty. It was this idea of being worthy of liberty, being worthy of God's blessings. It cost us something. And the way to do that was to obey the truth, to put political truths in place. He was the first well-known public figure in America. When he died, people in all the colonies knew him and mourned his death. John Adams said, The revolution was effected before the war commenced. The revolution was in the minds and hearts of the people, and change in the religious sentiments of their duties and obligations. So he understood this, that the real revolution happens in the heart. The essential difference between the American Revolution and the French Revolution in its origins is that the American Revolution was a religious event, whereas the French Revolution was an anti-religious event. That's what Johnson said. Now, before I go on, I want to clarify something, because there are going to be people watching this, and they're going to have a beef with what I'm saying. And that what they're going to be concerned about is that the founders were hypocrites. That they talked all about this natural law, natural rights stuff, and all the time they wouldn't give slaves their freedom, and they wouldn't give women any rights. Okay? First thing that you need to understand is that by the time they showed up, slavery had been in place for 150 years. These weren't the originators of slavery. These were the people that inherited plantations. And the answers to giving those slaves their liberty, the answers were complex. They had no self-reliance anymore. They had no education. They had no opportunities. There were the greedy and evil that didn't want slavery to end. And so we have to understand then, in their time, first of all. Another thing that you probably don't know is that when Jefferson in his mid-20s was elected to the Virginia legislature, his very first act was to try to abolish slavery. He fought it his whole life. When he wrote up the Declaration of Independence, if you go back and look through it, one of his grievances with the king was that the king would not allow the Americans to stop slave importation. There were no quick, easy answers to end it. So the compromise was to stop importation in 20 years and give the South some time to work toward abolishing it. But they did that because they wanted to send the message that slavery was on its way out. Just know that we've given the federal government the power in 20 years to end importation and even end slavery if they want. That was the message. So get ready. The same year that the Constitution was signed, the Northwest Ordinance was also signed, saying that there would be no slavery in any new states. Leadership was the other big part of all of this. There were obviously people in this country who wanted to perpetuate slavery, but at the time of the founding, the leadership did not. The leadership of the country wanted to end it, and that makes a big difference. They did the best they could in their time. Johnson said this about the American leadership. It is rare indeed for a nation to have at its summit a group so variously gifted as Washington and Franklin, Jefferson, Hamilton, Madison, and John Adams. In personal qualities, there was a difference as deep as the Atlantic Ocean between the men who led America and the men who led Britain during these years. It told from first to last. Great events in history are determined by all kinds of factors, but the most important single one is always the quality of the people in charge. And never was this principle more convincingly demonstrated than in the struggle for American independence. So the leadership tried to move in a direction of getting slavery on its way out. And we'll talk later about, in the next class or two, I can't remember which one, we'll talk about women and how even though they weren't given some of the same rights, there was a level of equality known nowhere else in the world. And that's what's important. It's not important that it doesn't work to look at our frame of reference and to make judgments from where we stand. It's important to look at where they were in their time and place and realize that it was more freedom for more people than there had ever been. And that's what's key. Now, let's go back to the Declaration of Independence. We all know the sentence. We hold these truths to be self-evident. There is a reason he wrote this in there. It was the foundation of their whole worldview. That men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator. Where do the rights come from? They come from God, because they can only come from two places. They can either come from God or they can come from man. If we really do have these rights, there's only two places they can come from. And the founder said they came from God. Because if they come from man, then man can take them away. Right? They can decide what your rights are. It's only when they come from God that you can stand on any solid ground. With certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln said that the Declaration of Independence was the foundation of his political philosophy, and that it is a statement of principles through which the Constitution should be interpreted. So we should look at what I just read in the Declaration, and this is a fun activity that's one of the assignments in the study guide, if you complete it, which I hope you do, that once you understand what the principles of government and economics are, you go back through the Declaration and look at all the grievances and find the principles that were being broken. But this is the point, is that that Declaration was a whole series of principles, and that the Constitution looked to the Declaration for its interpretation. That's an interesting idea. Now, he said something about pursuing happiness. And this is something that's little known in this country right now. I want to talk about for a minute. Words change, especially in democracies, and Tocqueville warned about that. That democracies, because of the idea of equality, would change the meaning of words. So especially when you study history, but when you study it all, I want to encourage you to always know what those words really mean, and don't assume that you know what they mean. Okay. The founders meant something very different by the word happiness than what we mean today. Today's definition is, this is how Adler put it: the individual is deemed happy whenever, at a given time, he has satisfied all the desires that he happens to have at that time. It's an emotion, right? It's a way I feel right now. I'm happy right now because everything I wanted, I have right now. That has nothing to do with the words pursuit of happiness in the Declaration of Independence. It's a completely different meaning and concept. This was the ancient definition that and remember, the founders studied ancient documents. Original sources was the way that they learned. Their conception was the ancient Greek conception that happiness was conceived as the goodness of a whole human life, and therefore as something which cannot be experienced or enjoyed at any moment during the course of a lifetime. It wasn't an emotion at all. It was a way of being. Happiness was who you were, and happiness meant that your life was in line with the principles that bring wholeness and health and happiness. It meant that your life had been a contribution to others. Your life had been one of wholeness and health, had enriched you, had enriched others. It had been one that had contributed to the world. It didn't have anything to do with how I feel right now. Now, William Blackstone, was the third most quoted author at the Constitutional Convention. He wrote commentaries on the laws of England. He said something very important about happiness, and this was published in 1765 through 69. And see if you can find here the founders talking through him, because third most quoted author. They were all very versed in their Blackstone. And what he says about happiness was their core belief about happiness. For God has so intimately connected, so inseparably interwoven the laws of eternal justice with the happiness of each individual, that the latter cannot be obtained but by observing the former. You can't have happiness unless you're observing the laws of eternal justice. That's what he just said. If the former, laws of eternal justice, be punctually obeyed, it cannot but induce the latter, happiness. In consequence of which, mutual connection of justice and human felicity, so because the consequence of this connection between justice and happiness, God has graciously reduced the rule of obedience to this one paternal precept, that man should pursue his own happiness. This is the foundation of what we call natural law. If this or that action tend to man's real happiness, and therefore very justly concluding that the performance of it is a part of the law of nature. So if you do something and it makes you truly happy, it's validated by the law of justice, the law of nature. It's part of the law of nature. Or, on the other hand, that this or that action is destructive of man's real happiness, therefore the law of nature forbids it. So, there are absolutes. There are laws of eternal justice. And by pursuing real happiness, the kind of ancient happiness that was a contribution to society, the kind that made people better, real happiness, was in harmony with the law of nature. So you just needed to pursue your real happiness. Then everybody would be happy. And the law of nature would be obeyed. This is what Skousen said in the preface to the 5,000-Year Leap, and we can really understand a little bit better what he means now when we go back to that book. What human beings are really seeking is individual happiness, self-realization. Human happiness thrives only in a certain kind of environment. The prerequisites for that environment are being destroyed. Many millions of people do not understand what is happening to them. They just know that they are not genuinely happy. The answer to most of the problems is comparatively simple. Return to fundamentals, get back to basics. So the right to pursue happiness, because Jefferson told us that was a right, meant the right to pursue personal interests within the framework of obedience to natural laws. And that is so, so important for this generation to understand. More important than almost anything else we could say about government. That is the foundation of all of it. Now, another word that got changed that's also in that declaration is the word liberty. It comes from the word liber, which is the fundamental word for libro and library. It used to mean tree bark, which was paper that was used to engage in contract. If you had enough education that you could read and write, if you knew enough about law that you could make contractual agreements with people, then you had greater freedom than the rest of the poor around you. So there's a connection with this word liber in liberty to an obligation. It's all wrapped up in this idea of education. It's all wrapped up in this idea of absolutes. Freedom is used so often, but it comes from the word free, and we have an idea in our society about what free means. And so I like the word liberty better because it means more. It has a connotation about expecting something of us. And by the way, as a side note, 100 years ago, I'll tell people that I have a liberal arts education, I got a liberal arts degree, and they usually think I'm an artist because they don't understand that liberal used to mean basically the opposite of what it means today. It meant the education to be free. So the liberal arts was the foundational bachelor's degree program. It was the education for every man to be able to perpetuate freedom, create personal freedom. The truth shall make you free, because the foundational ideas in all areas of life, in health, in relationships, there are also truths. And freedom comes through obedience to those truths. It's the same in government. And that's what the founders are telling us. In the Road to Serfdom, Hyatt in his preface says, well, when I wrote the original version of this book, I used the word liberal in its original meaning. He says, I'm very sad about it. I don't know why Americans have let that word be changed. It was an indispensable word to them. They've let it be changed to mean the opposite now. Mortimer Adler, who was a great advocate of liberal arts education, said this: liberal education frees our minds by disciplining them. So there's this connection between freedom and discipline. Our minds are free to think more creatively, to problem solve, because we've disciplined it by creating a hierarchy of truths for ourselves, and we'll talk about that more later too. So there's this equation for liberty. There's absolutes, you find them and live them, and then you have liberty and happiness. The founder said they would go hand in hand. I want to end with a couple things by a man named Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He was a Russian intellectual who was sent to the Russian gulags, like a concentration camp type situation, and spent time there. He wrote a book called The Gulag Archipelago. But anyway, he came to America and he spoke at Harvard, and his message was not happily received. We could just say that. But he said some things to America about America that America didn't want to hear. This was in the 70s. And he was right on. And there's a lot we can learn from his view. Here he is in a situation of no liberty. And he comes to America and sees our declining liberty. And I think lovingly wants to warn us. He said, Should someone ask me whether I would indicate the West, such as it is today, as a model to my country, and of course, don't we think this? Aren't we so proud of ourselves? We have something to teach the whole world. We are fabulous. We're wonderful. Everybody should be like us. And hi, you should want to be like us. And this is what he's referencing. Frankly, I would have to answer negatively. No. I could not recommend your society in its present state as an ideal for the transformation of ours. Can you believe that? Here's why. Through intense suffering, our country has now achieved a spiritual development. Remember the Tytler cycle? You remember how they have no bondage? Remember how they have bondage first? Achieved a spiritual development of such intensity that the Western system in its present state of spiritual exhaustion does not look attractive. A fact which cannot be disputed is the weakening of human beings in the West, while in the East they're becoming firmer and stronger. And why? Because they've had to find God and absolutes again. They've had to figure out how liberty was lost and how in the world they're going to get it back. And there's a level of commitment to each other and to truth. There's a deeper level of love there than we're experiencing here. And then, and this hurts, this is what he says about us. A decline in courage may be the most striking feature which an outside observer notices in the West in our days. Of course, there are many courageous individuals, but they have no determining influence on public life. And then he says, and you can look at the Tytler cycle, should one point out that from ancient times, decline in courage has been considered the beginning of the end? So, now we're all depressed. It's all over, we just go home. There are answers, but we have to go through the pain and have the willingness to look at who we really are first before we can fix it. When you're not honest with yourself, you can't fix it. When you don't take responsibility, you can't fix it. So, let me read you a couple things that might give us some hope. Obviously, hope in the principles. Maybury said, if enough people learn what is happening, we do have a good chance to get out of this without too much damage. Hayek taught, the most important change which extensive government control produces is a psychological change, an alteration in the character of the people. This is necessarily a slow affair, a process which extends not over a few years, but perhaps over 1 or 2 generations or more. This means that even a strong tradition of political liberty, such as we have, the greatest tradition of political liberty, arguably, is no safeguard if the danger is precisely that new institutions and policies will gradually undermine and destroy that spirit. And we're going to talk in our 3rd class about exactly how that has happened in America and how we can restore it. The consequences can, of course, be averted if the spirit asserts itself in time and the people not only throw out the party which has been leading them further and further in the dangerous direction, but also recognize the nature of the danger and resolutely change their course. So we can do it, it's just going to take some work. And it might take a generation or 2, but that's okay because we'll increase liberty instead of decrease it. Now, Thomas Jefferson said this, when the government of its choice shall manifest a tendency to degeneracy, we are not to at once despair, but that the will and watchfulness of its sounder parts will reform its aberrations, recall to it the original and legitimate principles, and restrain it within the rightful limits of self-government. So that's our answer. Find the principles and live them. And that's what this class, this series of courses is all about. And next time we'll talk about the founding generation's education, how they found the principles and begin to talk about what those are. See you then.